We're learning more tonight about this horrific crash of a Boeing 737 in China. That passenger jet was just 6 years old. It was well into the flight.
Aeroflot Flight 593 crashed on a routine flight between Moscow and Hong Kong, killing 75 people.
Well, just into CNN, really disturbing, stunning new video. It shows the moment that Ukrainian plane crashed in southwest Tehran.
U.S. Air Flight 405 took off from New York's LaGuardia Airport in icy conditions. It only got up about 40 feet before an engine stalled and the plane crashed.
We've had from China, where a passenger jet has crashed.
Tonight in Winder, pictures show the wreckage left by a small plane that crashed moments before landing.
As passengers of consumer airlines, we put a great amount of trust in the person behind the controls each and every time we fly. And to our credit, we never do know what we're getting when we purchase that plane ticket and board that massive jet. Most times, we don't even see the pilot's face. All he or she is to us is a voice over the intercom telling us we've reached our cruising altitude and that we're now safe to move about the cabin. Occasionally, the voice points out a pretty landmark on a clear day, the Statue of Liberty coming up on the left, snow-capped Mount Shasta to the right. Sometimes there are warnings, although nothing too big. A couple storm clouds up ahead, perhaps a bit of turbulence to liven things up a bit. The godlike voice will also tell us we have only minutes left to land, our seats should return to their upright position, and that is usually the extent of our relationship with the guy or girl behind the controls. We place our lives in their hands, yet we're given a name out of a hat as far as we're concerned. In all fairness, we really don't know how experienced they are. We don't know how much sleep they've had or if they've pounded back a few brewskis before the flight. And in fact, there have been plenty of incidents to scare us into being wary. In 1999, a suicidal pilot forced a Boeing 767 to do a nosedive into the Atlantic Ocean, killing all 217 passengers and crew on board. In 2014, Malaysian Airlines Flight 370 became the biggest mystery in aviation history when it disappeared off the radar completely. It is with good reason that one of the leading theories about Flight 370 is that its own dive into the Indian Ocean was a deliberate act as well. Then the world has seen its share of intoxicated pilots too.
This morning, watch as this Delta pilot, accused of being intoxicated, makes it through initial security as he's getting ready to fly from Minneapolis to San Diego. But when Gabriel Schroeder gets close to his gate, a random secondary check is set up. Police say his demeanor changes and turns and walks away. And these surveillance cameras show the 37-year-old heading down a floor to a men's bathroom. He's in that bathroom for only 30 seconds, where police say they later found a bottle of vodka stuffed in one of the trash cans. Schroeder then heads back to the checkpoint, telling an officer he had to go back to the pilot's lounge to get his iPad. Schroeder passes and gets on the jetliner into the first officer's seat. Schroeder faces 2 charges.
A sole flight attendant on a plane going from Chicago to South Bend, Indiana, apparently intoxicated. ABC's David Curley has the story.
An example that readily comes to mind was in the case of Aeroflot Flight 821. Flight 821 ultimately came to an end when the pilot decided to ignore ATC recommendations and, instead, he attempted an excruciatingly clumsy landing which resulted in the aircraft performing a 360-degree barrel roll over its left wing before colliding with the ground. Considered the deadliest accident involving a Boeing 737-500, a number of factors are said to have contributed to this particular crash, including but not limited to spatial disorientation, lack of training, and also potentially serious alcohol intoxication. And then we have our cases of pilots just plain losing their grip, such as was the case with this pilot whose entire mental breakdown was caught on cam. Check it out.
Okay, if you don't feel safe, get off the airplane.
This is your captain speaking, okay. But never like this.
I'll stop, and we'll fly the airplane. Don't worry, I'm going to let my co-pilot fly it. He's a man. Okay?
It's a total meltdown. The pilot boarded in her street clothes and addressed the passengers over the intercom.
She said, let's take a vote. How many of you would like to take off now with me dressed as I am, or would you prefer that I take 10 minutes to get changed into my cute little uniform? Then she started talking about her divorce and political candidates, and the minute she mentioned that, a gentleman stood up and just yelled, "Whoa, enough, you're scaring me."
The pilot also insulted a mixed-race couple on board.
Did I offend you? Okay, so did I purposely offend you? I did. The answer is yes.
After 20 passengers insisted on getting off the United Airlines flight, the pilot quietly left the aircraft.
But what about just plain pilot error? Because one scenario we haven't covered yet is the one in which the pilots aren't intoxicated, they're not sleep deprived, they're not suffering a nervous breakdown, and they don't have any kind of death wish. What I'm getting at is, what if you were in a situation where your pilots were just plain stupid? This, as sad as I am to say it, was the case of infamous Aeroflot Flight 6502, which ended in disaster when it crashed on October 20th, 1986, killing 70 of 92 people on board. Flight 6502 was a Soviet domestic passenger flight. It was scheduled to fly from Yekaterinburg, the former Sverdlovsk, to Grozny, with one stopover at Venomous Airport in current-day Samara. The aircraft itself was designed by engineer Andrei Tupolev and was an updated version of the Tupolev Tu-134. The original Tu-134 was intended for short and medium haul routes and had a capacity of 56 passengers. As the story goes, Nikita Khrushchev, then leader of the Soviet Union, was so impressed by how quiet the airliner was that he asked the engineer to design a similar plane for Aeroflot. The result was the Tu-134A, released in 1968, which was a stretched version of the 134 except with more powerful engines and a capacity of 72 passengers. This style of plane would continue to be built until the year 1989, and Aeroflot would be its most lucrative client. Now back to our fateful flight. The Tu-134A in operation was a 7-year-old narrow-body Tupolev. The pilot in command of the craft was Alexander Kliuyev, and the co-pilot was Gennady Zhirnov. On board were 87 passengers and 7 crew members. Even though I haven't come across anything stating that it was a contributor to the crash of Flight 6502, it would be apt to notice that with its total of 94 total people on board, this exceeded the aircraft's capacity by 22 individuals. At any rate, though, after becoming airborne following the takeoff from Koltsovo International Airport, everything went smoothly for a vast majority of the first leg of this flight. But then, as they got closer and closer to their layover destination, things would take a disastrous and deadly turn. As the story goes, the captain and first officer had been discussing subjects to do with things like plane altitudes and, various plane landings and such. And so it was somewhere over the Ural Mountains, not far from the Venomous Airport, when the captain proposed they turn talk into action. Or more specifically, Kliuyev declared that he could land the plane blindly with the autopilot off and without any visual cues whatsoever. What prompted this idea to pop into the captain's head is unclear. Boredom? Senseless bravado? Had they no espresso left in the cabin? It's ultimately immaterial because for most normal people, this should have been the end of that conversation. And yet, for some jacked up reason, First Officer Zhirnov actually took his colleague up on the crazy bet. Mind you, this was a bet which, if Zhirnov won, it would mean near certain death. It's not public knowledge what these two had been smoking, but as I guess is sometimes, maybe possibly the case between two overconfident young lads looking to prove themselves as fearless warriors of the sky, all bets were on. The curtains to the cockpit windows were drawn so that yes, the captain literally was flying blind. He could not see out of the windows. Autopilot was disengaged and the overconfident Captain Kliuyev prepared for an instrument-only landing that would go down in history. Now, before we go into how it all ends, let's talk about plane landings a bit. I am no expert in aviation, but thanks to the internet, there's nothing anyone can't learn the bare basics of in a matter of just a couple clicks and a few minutes of time. The approach, aka landing, suggested by Air Traffic Control, ATC, was an NDB approach. And an NDB, or non-directional beacon approach, is one of several types of non-precision approaches, which for safety reasons have mostly been replaced by precision approaches in more recent times. An instrument approach, or instrument approach procedure, is a series of predetermined maneuvers for the orderly transfer of an aircraft operating under instrument flight rules from the beginning of the initial approach to a landing or to a point from which a landing may be made visually. So, it may be certainly argued that in a non-precision approach, visual cues are more necessary than ever. Because, putting it a bit roughly, in a non-precision landing, you simply don't have all of the information presented to you in the same neat fashion as you have in an instrument approach. All in all, the blind type of landing this pilot was proposing could be seen as almost akin to having a death wish. And of course, meanwhile, well, do you recall how we started this segment talking about the faith we blindly put into our pilots? The sad thing about Aeroflot Flight 6502 is that as they were touching down above the airport in Samara, passengers were likely feeling good about the thought of touching down from a flight without any incident. Several were probably looking forward to getting back home to their loved ones, and the rest probably anticipated the simple pleasure of getting to stretch their legs for a bit before embarking on the second part of the route. Little did anyone on board Flight 6502 have an inkling of the shenanigans going on in the cockpit. Little did they have a hint of the calamity that was about to befall and the 70 lives that were about to be cut short due to an immature bet. And now, returning to the cockpit, as they approached the runway, Captain Kliuyev could not see where he was going. He had only the instruments and dials on the dashboard to guide him. Yet, when the pilot reached an altitude of 200 feet and a warning went off to let the captain know of his proximity to the ground, it's unknown why Kliuyev ignored that warning, and he also would ignore the ATC's advice to abort the landing and turn around. Now, upon finally removing the curtain and noticing the mess they'd gotten into, there were attempts made at correcting the situation, but it was all too little, too late. The problem was that his severe miscalculations of both the plane's speed and altitude on the way of its descent, well, when the plane hit the ground, they saw that the pilot, in fact, had overshot the runway. The plane ultimately touched down at a speed of 150 knots, otherwise known as 280 kilometers per hour or 170 miles per hour. The aircraft flipped over onto its back just before igniting into flames, a crash that caused the deaths of 70 people on board. Another top-secret report revealed slightly different figures, but in the end, the consensus on casualty count is 70 in all. Miraculously, of the 24 people to survive the crash, were all 14 of the children on board the flight that day. Ironically, both the captain and co-pilot survived the crash as well, initially. But co-captain Zirnov is said to have died from heart failure and/or smoke inhalation while he was en route to the hospital just after making a valiant attempt to rescue as many victims as possible. The guy flying the plane would live, and he would be tried a year later in 1987 for his negligence. Kliuyev was ultimately sentenced to 15 years for his brazen rule-breaking, but that would later be reduced to 6 years served. During his trial, Kliuyev's actions would be called arrogant, among other things. One thing that's interesting to me about the story of Aeroflot Flight 6502 is the fact that also on board Flight 6502 were navigating officer Ivan Makhono as well as flight engineer Kyuri Komzatov. I can't help but wonder, where were these guys while this crazy bet was taking place? Were they asleep? Were they standing there cheering on the guy behind the controls? What? In conclusion, there really isn't all that much to conclude about this, except maybe to just go back to emphasizing how important it is for especially commercial airlines to make sure that they do whatever they can to make sure they hire the right people. Whether this includes different types of psych evals, higher standards upon hiring, or some other kind of protocol altogether, it's just another one of those things incumbent on the airlines to do. The crash of Aeroflot Flight 6502 was considered massive, so much so that photos of the actual wreck were concealed back then by the KGB. These photos were finally leaked to the public by the Fire Department Chief Colonel A.K. Karpov. He had rendezvoused with the KGB officers on scene at the crash site. Karpov smuggled the photos out, and many years later they emerged for the public to see. Those are the photos you see here. The photos may not be of the greatest quality, but they do give some idea of the devastation the careless and inconsiderate pilot caused. Note is the rarity of which a crash is attributed to pilot negligence alone, and Aeroflot Flight 6502 was sadly one of them. In conclusion, even though we just got done talking about a pretty scary scenario that none of us as mere passengers ever want to find ourselves in, this is something that happens rather rarely, and bad flights are in the huge minority when compared to the flights that go well. And it's for that reason that I hope you all will let this video serve not just as information about the sadly preventable demise of all the people on board Flight 6502, but also as a reminder to be grateful for the many pilots who do their job well in effort to bring all their passengers back on ground safely. As my late father always told me to do, make sure to issue a thank you to those good pilots before you walk out that door and into the terminal. As for the victims of Flight 6502, may they all be remembered.